Katerina Jakob watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Jakob saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review with Chris Driscoll and Rainer Shea. Tonight's episode, the episode for November 18th, 2021, has the theme of American imperialism at home and abroad. And we start out with our first topic. U.S. uses Yugoslavia war model for its domestic counter-revolution by Rainer Shea.
In order to fight back against the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, the lower classes in general need to be united. And how do you destroy the unity of the masses? Well, firstly, you stoke ethnic tensions. You do what the reactionaries and their intelligence backers in the United States have been doing these last couple of years, and scapegoat China for COVID-19. You incite all of these hate crimes. You create all of this racial division by blaming Black people for rebelling against racist police state. And you center this, most importantly, around anti-communism. You create this massive psyop, which claims that the PRC has been carrying out a genocide against Uyghurs. And you ingrain this belief so deeply into the American psyche that something like 2/3 of Americans, according to Pew Research, now believe that the U.S. should sabotage its economic ties with China over human rights. And obviously, they're mainly thinking about the so-called Uyghur genocide when they answer yes to this. And this is part of a psychological warfare campaign that's quite deliberately designed by NATO. In a NATO-sponsored study from last year, they say that cognitive warfare now needs to be added officially to the same status of sea warfare, land warfare, air warfare, because according to this NATO-sponsored report, cognitive warfare is similarly important for the geopolitical survival of these imperialist powers, if not more important, because it's clear that the thought process behind this, that as conditions deteriorate, as capital contracts and austerity keeps being implemented more severely, more and more people are getting susceptible to class consciousness. So they have to try to sabotage this, blunt the development of revolutionary awareness by implanting all of these wild ideas about the largest socialist state in the world right now, China, supposedly committing a genocide against the Uyghurs. And I think this is comparable to Yugoslavia, the Yugoslavia sabotage of socialism, in that there is such an overwhelming campaign of disinformation, not just any disinformation, but specifically atrocity propaganda. In that case, the Serbs were scapegoated. Milosevic, the socialist leader, was made out to be a genocidal war criminal to turn a lot of people in the region against him, and to manufacture consent both within the US and within the targeted nation for the dismemberment of the last bastion of socialism in Europe. And I see a lot of parallels to that in the anti-Chinese propaganda campaign that we're seeing now.
Yeah, that's a really good point, a really astute point. But I wonder if these U.S. thinkers, these U.S. imperialist think tanks and so forth, I wonder if they really understand what they're doing, if they really understand the downside of this, because look what happened to Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, before Tito died, was a shining example of a multi-ethnic, multinational nation of people who all got along together, who intermarried, who had different religions. And the U.S., starting in 1983, when it put out its secret document laying out this method of disassembling Yugoslavia, they went about sowing the seeds of religious hatred one against another, of ethnic hatred one against another, using acts of terrorism that they themselves often actually perpetrated. You know, it was the American CIA would go into Yugoslavia and kill somebody in a mixed neighborhood, kill a Bosnian Muslim, for instance, and blame it on the Serbs. I want to point out too that Milosevic was turned over by a future Yugoslav government, or a future Serbian government, to a tribunal, a tribunal that put him on trial for the crimes he was alleged to have perpetrated. And he spent many years in jail. He was a sick man, and finally he died in jail. And only afterwards did the court, the international court in this case, come to conclude that Milosevic was not guilty of any of the crimes that he was charged with. So, you know, that is something that years after the events appears on page 37 of the New York Times, you know. In other words, it's buried. So even to this day, the overwhelming majority of Americans still think of Milosevic as this evil guy who conspires to murder and create ethnic and religious hatreds and destroy his own country, which obviously that would be ridiculous in the first place, because why would the president of the country do things like that that would help to disassemble his own country, that would help to destroy, to kill his own country? What the idiots who run America, the toadies of the capitalist ruling class, what they don't seem to understand is that by using these methods, they're very likely to end up destroying America, disassembling, killing America. Not that it hasn't already done so to itself many other ways, but you know, it just strikes me as a really senseless and desperate method of operation. There's already a vast amount more violence against Asian people because of what they're doing to sow hatred against the Chinese. They're telling these lies about the Chinese. And they do the same thing to Black people, to Chicanos, to Native Americans. It's really, it's quite. The one good thing out of all this is that the American imperialists are now admitting that they're adding this cognitive warfare to their other forms of warfare. So we have now the bad guys, the evildoers, actually admitting that they use cognitive warfare on their own people. We really need to exploit that. We need to be exploiting it over and over and over. The U.S. admits that it uses cognitive warfare on its own people over and over again, so that sooner or later, everybody comes to understand, everybody in the United States comes to understand that if it's said by the American military or by the American CIA or by the American media that these other entities run, it cannot be believed. And in a certain sense, we're a lot of the way there, because people remember the WMDs that were not there, the Gulf of Tonkin incident that didn't really ever happen. You know, the over and over again, we can, if you name a war, there's some lie that they told and only later came out that it was a lie. We need to constantly be reminding people of these lies, and reminding people now that the United States government says that they will use cognitive warfare on us. So, yeah. Anyway, topic number 2, Syria's My Lai U.S. massacred 70 civilians and covered it up. And this was exposed surprisingly by the New York Times. The articles that I'm referring to here is Aaron Mate from, and it was published in Information Clearinghouse just a few days ago. There was another article from another source by Caitlin Johnston, also referring to this massacre and tying it in with the Assange persecution. But the New York Times has exposed one of the U.S. military's worst massacres and cover-up scandals since the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. And I'll just read you a few highlights from this article. On March 18th, 2019, amid a battle with the Islamic State fighters, the U.S. Air Force bombed a crowd of civilians taking shelter in the town of Baghouz, Syria, killing a reported 70 people. The attacks occurred within a 5-minute span, an initial strike, and then another with heavier bombs as the survivors fled. That's what we used to call the Obama double tap. You know, you hit them first time and then come back 5 minutes later and hit them again after the ambulances are there and the first responders are there and people like that who come to help, and you bomb them again so you get all those people as well. This is a deliberate, very deliberate war crime. Anyway, the Times' David Phillips and Eric Schmidt report, without warning, an American F-15E attack jet dropped a 500-pound bomb on the crowd, swallowing it in a shuddering blast. As the smoke cleared, a few people stumbled away in search of cover. Then a jet tracking them dropped one 2,000-pound bomb, then another, killing most of the survivors. The U.S. military personnel in Qatar watched the attack in real time via a surveillance drone at the scene. The high definition footage showed that only 2 or 3 armed men were near the crowd and were not engaged in any kind of combat activities that would have justified a defensive military strike. Who dropped that? A confused analyst typed on a secure chat system being used by those monitoring the drone. 2 people who reviewed the chat log recalled. Another responded, we just dropped on 50 women and children. An initial battle damage assessment quickly found that number of dead was actually 70. Instead of accountability, at nearly every step, the military made moves that concealed the catastrophic fight, Phillips and Schmidt wrote. The site of the bombing was bulldozed. The unit that conducted the strike vindicated itself. Key evidence was buried. Military logs were altered, and investigations were stalled and subverted. Although the Pentagon's independent inspector general managed to launch a probe, the report containing its findings was stalled and stripped of any mention of the strike. The bombing was called in by a classified Special Operations Unit, Task Force 9, which led U.S. ground operations in Syria. 2 months after the March 2019 massacre, the task force completed a civilian casualty report on the strike that claimed that only 4 civilians were killed. It also determined that the strike was lawfully conducted in self-defense. The Bughu's killings likely only came to light because of whistleblowers who challenged the cover-up from within. Lieutenant Colonel Dean W. Corsack, an Air Force lawyer present at the Qatar Air Base when the massacre was observed, immediately ordered officials to preserve the evidence, including video, and urged superiors to open a war crimes investigation. When they refused, Corsack alerted the Pentagon's independent inspector general. Earlier this year, after 2 years of inaction, Corsack shared details about the cover-up with the Senate Armed Services Committee. I'm putting myself at great risk of military retaliation for sending this, he wrote. Senior ranking US military officials intentionally and systematically circumvented the deliberate strike process. Corsack wrote that a unit had initially entered false strike log entries, clearly seeking to cover up the incidents. Calling the classified death toll shockingly high, he said the military did not follow its own requirements to report and investigate the strike. There was a good chance, he wrote, that the highest levels of government remained unaware of what was happening on the ground. When Corsack alerted the Air Force's Office of Special Investigations, an Air Force major replied that the office would likely only probe the massacres if there was a potential for high media attention concern with outcry from local community government. Sensitive images may get out. The Senate Armed Committee reached out to Corsack after being approached by another whistleblower, Gene Tate, an investigator at the Pentagon's Inspector General's office. Tate told the Times that he witnessed similar stonewalling and censorship. So there you have it. After all that, then finally the New York Times got a hold of it and did an article about it. And now several other publications have followed suit to expose this massive war crime, this massacre, deliberate double tap bombing that took the lives of 70 people and injured probably many, many, many more than that.
It sounds like this was done by a rogue person. That's at least the impression I get, since it didn't happen with the approval of the actual strategists. And it didn't sound like the military thought there was anything practical, anything to be gained from this. Nonetheless, these kinds of things, it seems like the military decides that even though it's not practical, even though they know they don't have anything to gain from it, they have accepted that these kinds of things will happen. And if and when they do, the military's protocol is to cover it up.
Yeah, well, no, it doesn't sound at all like that to me. What it sounds like to me is that this is typical MO, typical modus operandi. This is what they typically do. This is the way they operate. And it never comes out because despite all these official methods for investigating this kind of war crime, the fact is that normally no one says anything about it. No one objects to it. So it just goes on and you never hear about it. This is the tip of the iceberg. They do this all the time. And I've been watching this for decades. This is the way American war is fought. It's fought with war crimes. The war crimes are so multitudinous, so many, and within the military, everybody knows that if you're smart, you don't say anything about it, because if you do say something about it, it's the end of your career. You become the victim. There are many, many cases like this where look at what was his name?
Manning.
Manning. Look at Manning as a for instance. You know, Manning saw this and he said something about it. But typically, no one says anything about it because they all know that you'll end up like Manning, or you'll end up like Assange. You'll end up like the many, many, many government and military personnel who said things about this kind of thing, and they became the victim. Look at Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden is still today hiding out from American assassins because he exposed this kind of typical war crime. This is not at all something that's done by a rogue operation of any kind. This is what they do. This is the way they operate. In my opinion, after seeing a hell of a lot of evidence to that effect.
Well, it's not, I'm confused about it because it sounded like others in the chain of command were acting like it was an accident, like it was out of the ordinary. And then the Pentagon felt the need to even think about it. So they knew that something wrong had been done. And that what I just said, I feel it's basically what you just said, just in different words. It's the modus operandi. They see the war crimes as the cost of what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
I honestly, I feel it's hard for me to empathize with the thought process of a terrorist. Like, why would you kill innocent people seemingly for no reason, or for no other reason than that it has a vague general potential to make the general population fear you more. It feels, it's incomprehensible to me how somebody could have such an inhumane way of thinking.
Why they do this is because they're trying to destroy Syria. And this kind of action destroys the country. You know, they first of all, think about the average person who lives in Syria. You think this could have happened to me. I could have been there. You know, well, what's your thought? Well, I better get the fuck out of Syria. You know, this is ethnic cleansing. This is mass murder on an overwhelming basis. After all, 1 million people so far have died in this Syrian war that the Americans have been perpetrating. We hardly ever hear about this war, but 1 million people already have died. And something like 7 or 8 million Syrians are either domestically refugees, they're refugees within their own country, or they're refugees outside their country. There are millions of Syrians who've left the country because they know that this could happen to anybody at any time. This is what the American imperialists are after. They want to destroy Syria. They don't want it to exist as a country. They want to destroy it except for those parts where the oil exists, which they already have, have control of. And the rest of the country, they want to destroy it. Syria used to be thought of as, as like the Paris of Southwest Asia. It was a beautiful country, a beautiful capital in Beirut, and these people have done great damage to it, and it'll take decades and decades for Syria to recover from this, even after the Americans stopped this horrible war on the Syrian people, on all of the Syrian people. Doesn't matter who they are, because they want to destroy the whole country. So next on the list, NATO's spreads. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, when I suggested it might have been a rogue operative, I was saying it in the context of being aware that so-called rogues are supported by the system. I mean, that we do see this all the time, and it's
these aren't rogues though. These are just average guys, and they do.
They're
the average military.
They would like
and they do what they're told to do. This is what they're told to do. It's not on paper anywhere, but it's what they're told to do. It's the orders they're given, and that's the thing about being in the military. If you're given an order, it doesn't matter whether it's on paper or not. You have no way to prove that you were given that order, but you were given that order verbally by your superior officer. So you do it, or you're in a fuckload of trouble. I mean, your life is ruined. You're in a really terrible situation. And this is why the overwhelming majority of military people who go into this, the rank and file working class military people, come out of it thinking this is all wrong, this war is wrong, this country is wrong, and things are really fucked up because that's the way they're treated. But as long as they're in there, they can make the judgment that they're going to ruin the rest of their own lives and possibly end up spending the rest of their lives in jail to say something right, to do the right thing, or they just shut up. And the overwhelming majority of people will just shut up. They're not bad people. They're just smart people who don't want to ruin their lives over something that it isn't going to affect people at home anyway. No one's going to believe them, Anyway, the next topic on the list, NATO spreads fascism to further military buildup of the new Cold War. Did you get that?
Right. This is another example of what we were just talking. Not muted. This is another example of what we were just talking about, where the U.S. sees dictatorship as part of the cost of advancing its own interests. I quote this neoliberal economist who said that it's possible for a dictator to be liberal. And that's the way that U.S. foreign policy has been going about things in both Cold Wars. If you could really say that the original Cold War ever really ended. The U.S. has installed a fascist regime in Ukraine that's not officially a dictatorship, but is always going to have a Nazi government for as long as Washington has enough influence to meddle effectively within that country. And the U.S. NATO continue to militarily back the fascist regime in Poland, even though even the European Union has been threatening to cut off funding for Poland as penalty for Poland's implementation of so-called LGBT free zones. There are these zones with symbolic legal language that essentially is designed to empower homophobic, transphobic people to commit hate crimes, which have been increasing in Poland. NATO sees this as part of the cost of their geopolitical interests, because Poland has been engaging in joint military exercises with Ukraine. Poland has been scapegoating the Belarusian government by claiming that Belarus has manufactured the border crisis along the Poland-Belarusian border. There's this trend towards fascism, if not outright dictatorship, within the bloc that US imperialism controls. And Washington wants to do the same in places like Belarus and Russia. There are leading opposition figures in both Belarus and Russia that are known to affiliate and express views that are Nazistic. There's Alexei Navalny, who is a known racist that is affiliated with the equivalent group to the Proud Boys. And in Belarus, there's this so-called journalist who was revealed to have fought with Ukraine's Azov battalion. The Azov battalion is the militia that's been committing crimes against Jews and Romas. They're the spearhead of the ethnic cleansing operation in Ukraine. And Washington and the imperialist media are supporting this figure who is directly tied to that.
Spreads fascism to further military buildup in new Cold War. Next on the list, Biden virtual summit seen as a possible beginning to reduced tensions, but yields no breakthroughs. President Xi and Biden held a virtual summit on Monday in which the two discussed a range of issues, including human rights, climate, trade, the pandemic, arms control, and Taiwan. A signal for modest hope, one newspaper wrote. A cooling down of hostilities, wrote another. A highlight of neither nor resolution nor major breakthroughs. When major US media with different political leanings interpreted the most important interaction between the top leaders of the world's two major powers, there were mixed messages. Still, a major tone was that the two leaders communicated directly with each other in a respectful and cordial manner. When some of the foreign experts told the US media that it's a different China now, as the US playing hardline policy does not appear to have worked out in wrestling with China, Chinese experts attributed such fundamental changes in the way China interacts with the US on the basis of equality and fairness a new form of Chinese diplomacy shaped from a position of strength. Still, officials from the current administration, including US President Joe Biden himself, chose to play a word game in the face of domestic political pressure. For some American hawks, the political elite, it is difficult for them to accept a different China with whom they need to deal on an equal footing. But they have to do so as they have no choice but to work with China to tackle domestic and international challenges, experts said. Some observers believe that China has gained an edge in the latest interaction with the US as American hawks, including Trump-era politicians like former anti-China figure Peter Navarro, called it a Biden surrender. A strong leadership, China's overall development, the country's resolute and effective response to the COVID-19 epidemic, climate change, and other aspects gave China the edge at the summit. Shen Yi, a professor at the School of International Relations and Public Affairs of Fudan University, told Global Times on Wednesday. My impression, he said, of the summit is that, bearing a bigger picture in mind, China came up with a series of important proposals for the China-US relationship in a constructive way, standing on the side of the international community with a shared future. So there's at least, and this article comes from the Global Times from Tuesday, and gives you a little bit of an idea of the reactions in China and the reactions in the United States, some reactions worldwide about Biden and Xi meeting. There was no big splashy communique that came out of this virtual meeting, but it was, you could say, maybe a first step towards a cooling down of hostilities that everyone in the world hopes to see. So we'll only hope for the best. There you have it.
What I want to do now that I hear this news about the Cold War with China supposedly dying down is look up China Uyghur. What's the nature of the messaging around that right now? Because a couple months ago, the US media admitted that the Uyghurs aren't even really being involved in the de-radicalization process anymore. China has really died that down as the problem has been addressed. But as we saw this week, there was this rally in the UK protesting against the supposed mistreatment of the Uyghurs. And what do I see in the initial headlines? China dodges genocide reports as Xi Jinping and Joe Biden disagree on human rights. So it sounds like all that Biden has been willing to concede on is the objective reality that working with the PRC or not being totally antagonistic towards the PRC is in the best interests of Washington. Otherwise, all Washington would be doing is shooting itself in the foot. And, you know, it seems like it's going to keep doing that regardless.
Yeah. I'm not even sure that Biden is going to go that far. You know, I think Biden is at right now, what it appears to me is that Biden is walking the fence. He's playing both sides and hoping that neither one of them hate him too much for it. On the one side, he's keeping up the extreme hostility towards China, and then on the other hand, he's holding out the carrot of maybe sometime in the future some lessening of the hostilities, of the tensions. But overall, Biden's position politically is that, I mean, you said it just a little while ago, 66% of Americans now think that that U.S. trade with China should be gutted over the Uyghur incidents and other human rights incidents. So, Biden, even if he wanted peace and détente with China, is in a position where he can't go very far without running into a lot of opposition, even though he himself is responsible, at least in part, for the over-the-top propaganda that causes this hatred of China. So you've really got to wonder about it. It was good that the leaders met, even if virtually. I mean, pretty much everybody does virtual meetings these days, as opposed to in-person meetings. So there's nothing strange about that. But it's a step in the right direction. So, we can only hope for the best. Next on the list, supply chain collapse and imperialism's engineering of crises.
The U.S. imperialism is responsible for a growing amount of instability in the world today. And this is deliberate. The U.S. is using the destruction of state structures as a warfare strategy in places like Ethiopia, where the U.S. has been backing the terrorist organization, the TPLF, which apparently invaded last year deliberately during harvest time to make the maximum amount of people go hungry. So that's why there's one of the biggest famines in the world right now in Ethiopia. The U.S. is trying to do the same in Afghanistan by freezing its wealth. It's manufacturing a famine there with the goal of throwing the country back into total instability and chaos. We'll see how successful they are. We'll see how the Taliban can hold out at this point, because apparently things are really getting bad over there. And what's ironic is that perhaps less intentionally, but obviously due to deliberately engineered policies, as a consequence of these policies, the U.S. is experiencing a supply chain breakdown. And this is something really to take seriously, because right now there are tens of millions of people who are food insecure, as they say now in the United States. There are millions of people, tens of millions of people who are continuing to slip into extreme poverty in the United States. And for the supply chain to be breaking down right now is one of the worst things that can happen to these people, aside from outright collapse of the power grid or something like that. And that's, by the way, that's estimated by the Pentagon to be quite likely in the coming decades. The U.S. power grid is quite neglected and decrepit due to these neoliberal policies. And the supply chain is breaking down here because of U.S. imperialism, because we depend on the siphoning of labor and resources, these cheaply priced goods from the exploited countries. So now that US imperialism's contradictions are coming to a head, the first people to suffer are the most vulnerable populations, as is the case in all of these other places where US imperialism is engineering instability.
Right. We can expect some improvement in the electric grid, number one, because of the passage this week by Congress of the infrastructure, Biden's infrastructure bill, $1.3 trillion infrastructure investment. So crumbling bridges, crumbling dams, crumbling roads, all of these kind of things, as well as the crumbling crumbling grid, the electric grid, are things that are on the agenda now to fix. Unfortunately, Biden's initial bill was I think something like a $10 trillion bill. So it was whittled down to 1.3 trillion. So all of the social aspects of that bill that were initially included now have not been passed and will not be passed. I mean, they're still on the table officially in Congress. The other parts of the bill, what they did is they separated out the infrastructure from everything else, and made it into two different bills. But you know, it's not really going to benefit Americans in any of the other ways that it was supposed to have benefited Americans, which I pretty highly suspect that Biden engineered it that way to begin with. You know, Biden threw everything but the kitchen sink as far as social benefits into that thing, knowing that none of it would get passed by the entire Republican caucus of Congress and by a goodly amount of the Democrat caucus in Congress. And then in the end, he separates out the infrastructure plan and just goes with that. I mean, these kinds of imperialist engineered crises, there's plenty of room for those left, even in the United States, but certainly around the world in poorer countries that also suffer, like the United States does, from crumbling infrastructure and crumbling social safety net. The next and last topic on the list tonight is the Saker thinks Lukashenko must go and Russia and Belarus must truly unite. Now, the Saker is he's a military expert he lives in the United States right now, but he lived a long time in Europe, and his focus is European military European military issues. And I often agree quite a lot with the Saker, but in this case, his criticisms of Lukashenko, I do not agree with. Although I do certainly totally agree with the idea that Russia and Belarus must truly unite. Now, this is an issue that has been on the table for the last 20 years. Belarus and Russia signed an initial agreement for a Belarus-Russian union way back then. But things have not turned out it's still on the table, the idea of a Russian-Belarus union. And there is a unification in a lot of ways. But Lukashenko, over a period of time, over the especially the last 10 years, has flip-flopped on this issue of actually carrying through with the Belarus-Russian union. And in those cases, in that case where Lukashenko has dragged his feet on this, I do agree with the Saker that that has been bad for Belarus. But on the other hand, Lukashenko is a widely popular leader in Belarus. I mean, 70 to 80% of the Belarusian people are behind him, if not more. So there's reasons for that as well. But anyway, the Saker goes on to say, there is one thing which is obvious for all to see. If there is one thing which is obvious for all to see, it is that the EU and NATO hold one language against Belarus and another against Russia. For example, the EU has agreed to impose a fifth package of sanctions on Belarus, but their official statement does not mention Aeroflot, Russia, or Putin by a single word. Of course, Western politicians make all sorts of noise and grandstanding statements about Putin and Russia, but that is just that, hot air. They can bark at Russia all they want because they know that Russia does not care one bit about the noise, especially since the Russians fully understand that there's nothing the West can do or could do, even theoretically, against Russia, as she is simply too powerful. Ditto for economic sanctions. The EU has banned overflights by Belavia, but it has not touched Aeroflot yet. Why not? Simple, because Russia could simply close her airspace, which is currently the most expensive airspace on the planet, as it links Europe to the Far East Asia. Belarus, in sharp contrast to Russia, still remains weak, mostly because of Lukashenko's incompetence and lack of vision. That's the Saker talking. All he cares about is remaining in power, which also means that he does not want Belarus to be truly incorporated into Russia, lest he loses his status as king of Belarus or whatever he fancies himself to be. By remaining separate, Belarus and Russia gain nothing. They both only stand to lose on many levels. The good news is that Belarusian and Russian militaries are already deeply integrated, but that integration needs to be shown. And the best place to show it would be right at the Polish border. Again, pull back all the Belarusian border guards and replace them with a single regiment of Russian paratroopers, and that alone will radically change the tone and actions of the West. That would be the proverbial tripwire force, which would absolutely terrify the Poles and the rest of the clowns who are playing at this pretend almost war on the border with Belarus, including 600 Brits and assorted Germans and French units. So my solution to this entire crisis is simple: fully unify Belarus and Russia. The only thing preventing this today is Lukashenko. So this process has to begin by getting rid of him. So that's the the Sakers' views on this issue. My views are somewhat different. I do agree, though, that Belarus and Russia, there's really not a lot of difference in it. They speak a dialect of the same language. They're both Eastern Slavs. There is really many reasons for them to unify, and I know that Putin is all for the unification. You know, as the Saker said, Lukashenko has been dragging his feet on and off. Right now, he's not dragging his feet. Right now, he's being pretty friendly about it, mainly because of the terrible war that the EU and the United States and Britain are shoving his way. And Lukashenko knows now that he really needs Putin. He really needs Russia's backing, because the one thing that stops the imperialists in Europe and Great Britain and the United States is the fact that Russia will come to Belarus's aid and react forcefully, with force, to any kind of an attack by the imperialists against Belarus. So I think that this unification of Belarus and Russia is going to happen pretty soon now, in the next couple of years, given the way things are going. The issue of Lukashenko, you know, as I said, he's very popular. And there is a lot of reasons that he is. I mean, he might seem a little bit out there with some of his statements and so forth, but ultimately the people of Belarus trust him very highly. And they trust him because they know that he has kept the Soviet-style economic system that makes their country a socialist country, and that has allowed them to live a lifestyle, to live a standard of living that they could never, ever possibly enjoy under capitalism. And they've stood around right there on top of Eastern Europe, watching as one country after another, one Eastern European country after another, gave up socialism and adopted capitalism. And so they see the people of Belarus, who, by the way, have the highest standard of living of practically any country in Eastern Europe. They see what happens to their fellow Eastern Europeans when capitalism comes. And Lukashenko has kept the Soviet-style socialist system. He's kept, in my opinion, he's kept a workers, a socialist workers state to ensure the existence, the further existence and the defense of that socialist state, of the Belarusian people. And I think so there's a lot of reasons why people like Lukashenko. But we've all got to admit that the Belarusian people would be a lot better off in a union with Russia.
Wow, this really excites me. Just imagine how bad of a position the imperialists will be in if and when these countries unify. It's really strategic. It poses so many strategic possibilities for the anti-imperialist bloc, and the imperialists have everything to lose in that regard. Also, thanks for clarifying to me that Lukashenko is actually super popular, because I have heard even from communist sources like MR Online, or it might have been Morningstar Online, an article that was kind of conceding rhetorically to the narratives put forth by the imperialist media about Lukashenko, about how he's authoritarian. And you know, when you see that term thrown around, you should always be skeptical, because it can mean pretty much anything. Uh, I'm glad for that news. It seems like Lukashenko is likely to survive politically in spite of the war waged against him, and uh, I'm glad to hear they're about to unify.
Yeah. The authoritarian thing, yes, he's authoritarian. He's authoritarian about crushing any imperialist threat to Belarus. And that's part of the reason people like him so much and trust him so much. Yeah, they use their authority to crush imperialist plots, imperialist sabotage. And we know that if you're a socialist country, you get imperialist plots, imperialist sabotage. That's what happens. So, why are all the socialist countries, and all the socialist countries that have ever existed in the last 100 years, why have they all had authoritarian, if you want to call it that, strict security regimens? Because that's what you need to do. If you've got an imperial power that is constantly sabotaging you from within your own country, you need to crush that. That's a that's a given. That's part of the reason that a socialist workers' state is so essential to real existing socialism, because without that state and all of the oppressive apparatus of that state that's used against the spies, against the saboteurs, against those within the country who would join, sell out their country, sell out to the imperialists and do the bidding of the imperialists. You need that kind of security infrastructure. You're not going to live without it. So anyway, as far as Lukashenko's future, I mean, I don't know. The guy's he's like in his late 60s, I think. And in my opinion, it would not be a bad idea for him to decide to retire at the same time as Belarus and Russia create this new union. And let someone else come in and take his place, someone younger. It's my personal opinion that nobody should be the president of any country after the age of 65 years old. It's the same reason I don't think people should be allowed to drive after 65 years old. It's just fucking ridiculous. Having a doddering old idiot like Biden, who's half a foot in the grave, be president is fucking ridiculous. Simple, pure and simple. And the same goes for Belarus. I mean, somebody Lukashenko's age really doesn't belong as the president. He's too fucking old. But that's just my opinion. But as I said, Lukashenko is quite popular in Belarus. So we'll see. I trust the Belarusian people. You know, they're really, of the entire Soviet Union, the Belarusian people were probably the most advanced working class of any of them. That's why they have what they have today, and no one else in the Soviet Union except, well, there are a couple of other places in the former Soviet Union where they have some of the socialist state apparatus that they used to have, but Belarus is the most, of course, with I think something like 70% of the Belarusian economy is state-owned. So anyway, that's it for tonight, unless you have anything else to say, Rainer. No. Okay. Well then, first of all, thank you, Rainer, for everything you've done tonight, and as always. And I want to thank all of our listeners and viewers for tuning in, and invite you back again next week for another episode of Revolutionary Socialist Review. Until then, I bid you a sweet adieu.